like others, all the speakers today, I'd like to recognise the traditional owners. And in particular at a conference like this, I'd like to recognise and acknowledge the tens of thousands of years that Aboriginal people lived in relation to a very efficient food system, which was very resilient. And there's so much we've still got to learn about how Aboriginal Australians managed that food landscape. So just to tell you very quickly about myself, I'm a retired geezer, have been retired for 6.5 years from Macquarie Uni, and one of the main things I wanted to do in that retirement was to play music. So thank you very much, Bridget, for finishing with the Paul Simon number, which is just wonderful. I want to sing you a song that Pete Seeger wrote a tune for called Business, but I won't. But I'll tell you very briefly about it because it's absolutely fundamental to what I'm talking about. The song was written in the 1920s, and I was gobsmacked when I found out that it was, because it's actually about food futures markets. And I'd forgotten that food futures markets existed in the 1920s. And what they were about was ironing out fluctuations and risk that you get in food because it's based on natural landscapes which fluctuate with climate, with weather rather than climate. Very important distinction. Food futures markets in the 21st century are not about ironing out the risks with food. It's about ironing out the risks with money. And people go in and out of food securities markets, art securities markets, energy security markets to iron out risk in buying and selling money. And that's part of the financialisation of society. And before I retired, I did a fairly major study for Westrock on the labour market in Western Sydney. And I thought that was the last time I would do such a study, because I knew I was going to retire as soon as I could. Not that I disliked my job, I loved it, but I just wanted to get back to doing what I could never earn an income from, which was playing music. This year, in the last couple of months, I've been coaxed back to do another labour market study of what's happened to that Western Sydney labour market in the last 5 or 6 years. And the impacts of the financialisation of the global economy, of the national economy, of the regional economy are gobsmacking to me. And I've been studying this for 35 years. So the ratio of money floating around in society that buys and sells money, that speculates, that hedges, that does the things that food futures markets do. The ratio of that to the value, the total value of international trade and international investment is not 20 to 1, not 50 to 1, it's about 85 to 1. So that for every dollar that's circulating to pay for what we might call real stuff, there's 75 or 80 bucks circulating to speculate on risk and values of currencies. And the current value of the Australian currency and the current investment patterns are putting Australian manufacturing, including food manufacturing, in a new era. And I've been studying the decline of Australian manufacturing for the last 35 years. But it hasn't all been decline. But the changes in the last 4 or 5 years are warning signs. And so I'd like to endorse what Joel started today with. We have to reconstitute in our minds food security as part, in the short run, of poverty and increases in poverty in Australia. So I would endorse very strongly what Bridget said in the talk just before mine. So rather than repeat or give another version of what she said, I just want to talk about a couple of things. Lost my little budget. The first is to remind ourselves of why now. Because food insecurity has always been associated with poverty, and poverty's been with us. Some famous book said that once. But it's no surprise that there's been an upsurge of interest in food insecurity and food security. And I've got a couple of reasons which I think are really important. The first one is a decline in trust in the globalised food provision systems to deliver food to people who need it in the right nutritional qualities, in the right quantities, affordably. There is a decline in trust around industrialised countries. For all the massive amounts of food production that the globalised food system have given to us, there is simultaneously a decline in people's trust of the food system. A lot of it is about nutrition and public health. When you ask Australians about that, that's the first thing that usually comes out of their surveys. And it's not just about BSE or mad cow disease. It's about people's rising anxiety about nutrition and public health related issues, food scares. There's also now rising concern about what we've called this morning food insecurity, and it's that's related directly to poverty. And as Bridget very well showed us, the signs are there now for those increasing differences between rich and poor in Australia. But people also will get around to ticking the box about ecological sustainability, and that's a longer term issue. And all of the organisations that I've worked with or talked to in the last 10 years, the most recent one being Red Cross, know that the ecological sustainability of the Australian food system is not guaranteed, especially in the Murray-Darling Basin, which produces the lion's share of our food. And that it's the people that they have a brief to help the socially disadvantaged who will suffer most from ecological instability in our food production system. If it's bad when the system is reasonably stable ecologically, and they had figures there that we produce enough to feed 60 million people in Australia. Imagine what it would be like if we allow the wheels to fall off our clean, green food system. So there are also associated issues with energy use. There are understandings of the problem with the disconnect between people and their food supplies, which is one of the reasons why localisation of food is becoming seen as a way forward into a more trusted and a more secure food system. But it's got to be a more socially just system. Otherwise we aren't going to achieve sustainability in the medium to long term. Okay. So I want to talk very briefly about identifying the food insecure. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. We still have a dearth of systematic research in Australia about the food insecure. And I'm very pleased to endorse what the speaker said earlier today, Martin Laverty in particular. We need to collect and know more about food insecurity in Australia. We have some reasonably good studies that were done in the early part of the 21st century. 2005, a good study by Anglicare. We know that Australia is probably moving in line with places like Canada and the United States, which have much better data. But one thing I want to say about those, we can sometimes do no better than talk about 6%, 8%, 10% in the national economy. But I've just redone some work on unemployment rates in Western Sydney. And I looked at them at the 2011 census, 2006, 2001, 96, 1991. I thought, hey, I'm retired, I've got to stop there. Okay, so then I looked at where, not who, but where those unemployment rates were highest. And I took a place like Blacktown, which for those periods, all of those censuses had an unemployment rate above the Sydney-wide average or the Australian average, but it goes up and down, fluctuates. In boom times, the gap has shrunk. In bust times, a disproportionate number of people suffer from the immediate impacts of that economic uncertainty. So it fluctuates more wildly in some of the Western electorates local government areas than others. But when you map at a collected district level, the smallest unit that the census collects, you find that most collectors' districts in Blacktown have the condition of national unemployment, either better than the national statistic or about the same. So why has it got a local government figure that's always seeming to be above the average? And the answer is within that local government area that are clusters of collected districts where the unemployment rate is 15, 16, 25%. in the 2011 census. In other words, food insecurity, poverty, unemployment figures, they go together in Australia, and they're much more clustered geographically than people have the opportunity to realise, unless of course they're living in one of those clusters. And I have to say to you that the map of those clusters in 1991, 2001, 2006, 2011 is virtually identical. For 25 years, there has been no apparent movement in the geography of those disadvantaged clusters, which gives a lie to a couple of things. One important one is that it's about people's own fault, because Australia has one of the most mobile populations in the OECD. So people are moving in and out of those clusters, and those clusters show up with poverty, with social disadvantage, with unemployment, and that leads inevitably in this society to those difficulties with food that have been set out really well for us this morning. Okay, so it's a clustered problem, and it is about, it's multifactorial. There are so many things that go into the determination of those things. So I just want to backtrack a little bit. I'm sure I'll be able to do this. So I've spent some very important and useful time for me working with Red Cross, and I would endorse, if you get a chance this afternoon, to hear Jennifer Evans and her team talking about the Red Cross food security strategy. I want to make some more general comments, particularly along the lines of things that I learned in trying to help an organisation like Red Cross develop an overarching food security strategy to act as a framework for the individual and quite often regional and local activities that are done by that organisation. And I've looked at quite a few other organisations too, including food banks. So the upsurge in the importance of the not-for-profits, as Bridget said, is part of a much more general change in governance arrangements in countries like Australia. And it is, as she said, part of the rollout of what quite a lot of journalists and writers and academics like myself have been calling for a long time, neoliberalism. And one of the critics, one of the most important critiques of not-for-profits growing in importance, it's not that it's bad that they're doing that, it's absolutely crucial for the people that get fed, get assisted. But if we stand back and say, is this part of a secure food system, then I think we can see that it's not about food security. Food security is about doing broader things in relation to poverty, in relation to social inequality, in relation to the way our labour markets fit together in cities like Sydney. And as Joel said very passionately this morning, they are things that have been tackled in the past by the state with our taxpayer dollars that they keep talking to us about, and there have been quite major successes in the past in dealing with those kinds of issues. It's a political decision to stop dealing with them, and it's a political decision to say, it's much better if you do this thing yourself. It reminds me of the great enthusiasm for local employment initiatives in the 1980s when I started doing my work with the New South Wales State Government in relation to the metropolitan planning strategies. Local employment initiatives was all the rage. It was passing down what we thought of as a national responsibility to the smallest geographical scale and the least resourced. And all of you working in local government know that, and know also that it is the least stable in terms of the Australian political constitution. So there were local authorities trying to, as one of my colleagues in Britain said, drain the ocean with a teaspoon. It's not that there was anything wrong with the individual local employment initiatives. Some of them were fantastic, but they can't be expected to produce a secure operating labour market. And one of the real problems, and I've heard it again this morning, about neoliberalism is it reduces the argument about the state to a quantitative dimension. It says, what amount of government intervention constitutes a nanny state or a welfare state? And what amount of government intervention can we withdraw to which will constitute a more liberal state? That's a quantitative argument, and it's rubbish in terms of the role of the state. The state can only ever operate qualitatively. It will always intervene, but it will not always intervene on behalf of the same people and the same places. So be suspicious of an argument that tells you that the state must withdraw from the operation of economies, because since the Industrial Revolution and the onset of what we know as nation states, there has been no such withdrawal of the state from the life of its citizenry. It's a nonsense. So, let's make our voices heard in the way that Joel and all the other speakers today have suggested, and say that we need advocacy as well as these emergency schemes and as well as the quite structured programs that are now beginning to develop on food security. We need to tell the political structure that food insecurity in Australia is unacceptable. It's unnecessary and it's unacceptable. We should be helping with the food security problems that exist in our Asia-Pacific region. But there's no excuse for what I see as an inevitable rise in the food insecurity in one of Australia's largest urban regions, 2 million people, that's Western Sydney, where the signs are already there in the last 5 years that unless some corners are turned, we will have rising food insecurity in that place. I'm going to finish up by going to... This was my framework for working with Red Cross, which was a fantastic experience for me, I have to say, and working with other organisations. Okay. A three-pronged approach, and I think Red Cross will probably talk about this afternoon, that food security in the long run is only partly about supply. It is about that. And every time I read the United Nations definitions of food security, I applaud what's been added to it recently, which is that the food not only has to be available in the right quantities, nutritious, but it has to be culturally appropriate. You cannot wag your finger at people, whether it's in Western Sydney or as I was there 10 years ago working with local food initiatives in northeast of England, where one of the great issues for a friend of mine was to stop people eating so many Mars bars. You can't do that by wagging your finger at them. Neither can you talk more generally about what we all know to be true, that food and nutritional education is fundamental. But people know a lot more about food than we give them credit for sometimes. And there's a worker in Canberra, Jane Dixon, in the National Centre for Epidemiology, who did this wonderful study about chicken. And most of the lower to middle income people that she interviewed, they all knew that chicken was bad for them. But they said, at this time, in this place, I can't do without buying this commodity. The kids will eat it, they're fussy about other things, I don't have the time, I'm time short. But in the long run, we won't be feeding so much KFC to our kids. They knew about it, but what they thought was that the chicken was full of hormones. It wasn't. It hasn't been for ages. What it's full of is antibiotics, and nobody ever tells you that. Okay, so we've got to be careful that education is not separated from the whole range of issues that determines people's food security at particular times and particular places. Let's have the food banks. Why would you not want to put a loop in that takes some of that incredible waste out of the system? That's what Ronnie said eloquently this morning. But it's not about food security. It's about relief, and thank goodness we've got it. So, food security is also about access, affordability. Can you get to it? And I'm going to write in this report in a couple of weeks' time, which I think is going to be launched at the end of the month, that access to employment is only partly about jobs. Most of the places in Western Sydney currently with the highest unemployment rates are surrounded by both jobs, and they've got entrepreneurialism coming out of their ears. But Auburn being a classic example, Auburn has had one of the fastest growth rates of new employment in this city. But the stock of jobs, the variety of jobs has pulled well away from what the local people in that local government area have got access to in terms of their skills, in terms of what they need in the short term and the medium term. They are watching those jobs grow and they don't have access to them. There's a very important lesson in that for food security. So I'll finish off by recognising the last four. There are big issues in the food non-for-profit sectors, particularly about professionalisation, which has to happen. There are big issues in terms of government grants, which do give people the idea that they can't afford to rock the boat this week. There are also issues about having the time to form those networks and alliances right across the food provision system. We have to put our elements into the wider food provision system. And the last one is to say that, just to remind ourselves that people and organisations are involved on a daily basis in changing their food system. They need support from other agencies, they need support from us. But this is, to finish off, a plug for advocacy about food security. It's not good enough in Australia to put this onus onto the not-for-profit sector. Thanks for the indulgence.